Hey everyone, so today I'm going to go over a tutorial of how to instantiate objects, create custom objects, and add a player controller in my custom game API/framework. So today I'm going to again go over how to create a player controller, and to do that we're going to make two collision objects. So one of them is going to be the player themselves, and the other one's going to be the floor to move around on. So let's start by adding a floor object, and to do that we're going to go here into the src folder and just add a folder to hold all of our scripts. And now let's add a floor.hpp. So in this header file, you're going to want to make a class called, well, whatever you want, but in this case, floor. And it should be a child class of GameObject here. I don't know why that's throwing an error. It shouldn't be. It should be fine. And of course, make sure you include the header file for the engine itself. So this floor class is going to need a few functions. First of all, a constructor, and you can put whatever you want in here. So I'm going to put a position for the floor, a size for it, and I'll also put a color for the floor. We're going to make the floor a solid color in this. We're also going to need a destructor, and we're going to need to redefine the destroy function and the assign components function. What the destroy and assign components functions do is destroy is used for resource deallocation, and assign components is used for adding components, like in this case the texture renderer and the rigid body, to the floor object itself. Because many object components, like the two I just mentioned, need to take a shared pointer to the floor object itself, and to do that we need to have a function where you're getting that object pointer as an argument. So to define these functions, let's go to floor.cpp and include the header we just made. Something I forgot to mention is here's a private member. I'm going to add the color to store the color that we put into the constructor argument. And since floor is a subclass of GameObject, we're going to need to construct a GameObject here in the constructor, but that's fine because GameObject just takes two arguments, position and scale, and then we'll also assign the color. In the deconstructor, we're just going to call the destroy function, and for the destroy function itself, we're just going to call GameObject destroy. Floor, as this class, as you can see, currently doesn't have anything that we need to deallocate, which is why we're not putting more in here. And adding GameObject destroy is important because it does some important memory deallocation stuff. And now for the assign components function. So as mentioned before, we're going to add a rigid body and a texture renderer. So let's start with the rigid body. To add a component, you literally just call the add component function. And to specify which component, we're going to use the type, that is a rigid body. So the arguments for this function will take the constructor arguments for whatever component you're adding. So in this case, a rigid body. So let's go ahead and look at what components the rigid body needs for its constructor. So it needs this stuff, and obviously you can put whatever you want for these values. I'm going to put what I need for the floor to not be affected by other collision objects or by gravity specifically. Specifically, the floor shouldn't be moved around by other collision objects, so I'm going to set it's movable to false. And I also don't want it to fall because of gravity, so I'm going to set has gravity here to false. So now for the other component we need to add a texture renderer so that you can actually see the floor. And the texture renderer is going to take a shared pointer to a texture object. So let's first create the texture. For these L-texture constructors, you should be using gwindow. That is the global game window. And as mentioned before, we're going to make this a solid color from the color we stored from the constructor. So now let's add a component, texture renderer. And again, you can control click this to see what the constructor arguments are. I'm just going to leave all these default constructors as their defaults here. Okay, so now the floor class definition is done. So if we go to main, all we need to do is include script/floor. And then before we start the game, we're just going to go ahead and instantiate a floor. And much like the add component function, this instantiate function just takes whatever the constructor arguments are for the floor. So that is position, size, and color. So I'm just going to go ahead and put in some values here. So now that I'm instantiating a floor, if I go ahead and build the project, you'll see that there's now a floor here at the bottom of the screen. Perfect. So now let's add another object to be the player. If I go back into scripts, let me close this, I don't need it anymore. If I go back to scripts, I'll add player.hvp. So much like the floor header, we're just going to add a subclass of a game object. And just for a demonstration here, the player is only going to take one argument, the position, as its constructor. So now with this set up, let's go and create player.cpp. And define the arguments in a very, define the functions in a very similar way as we did with floor.cpp. Since we're not taking size as a constructor argument here, for the GameObject constructor, I'm just going to go ahead and hardcode the size. A typo here in the header. This should be shared pointer. And like the floor, here we're just going to be adding a rigid body and a texture renderer. So let's start with the rigid body. Add a component, rigid body. And unlike the floor, I'm not going to be redefining any of these last three arguments here because I do want the player to be moved by collision objects, and I do want it to be affected by gravity. So I'm just going to take these first three arguments, because they don't really matter for this demonstration, and paste them here. And for the texture renderer, the player is also going to be a solid color, and I'm going to make it red. Okay, so now that the player is all done, we should just be able to go to main, include player.hvp, and then instantiate a player. And remember, the only constructor argument that this function needs to take is position. I'm just going to spawn them at vector2, 0. So if we build the project, let's try that out. What's the issue here? Ah, there it is. I forgot the 2 here. In this constructor function should be a 2D vector. Why can't I edit this? Okay. Now that that's fixed, let's try again. Cool, so as you can see, now there's just a collision object that falls down from gravity. But obviously, I can't control this at all. So let's add some code to the player class that allows us to move it with the A and D keys. First, I'm going to add a redefinition for the function update. Now, update's a special function because it gets called once every frame. So if you want some kind of special code for any game object, you're going to want to redefine the update function. The next thing I'm going to add is some private members. First, I'm going to get a pointer to the rigid body component. Note that this isn't actually necessary because I could call the get component rigid body function every frame, but that's not very efficient. I'd rather just have a pointer to it. Okay, and now that we have this pointer is going to actually be memory that we need to deallocate in the destroy function. So to do that, we're just going to go rigid body equals null pointer here in the destroy function, and that'll automatically deallocate a shared pointer. And to get a pointer to the rigid body, add component actually returns a pointer to the component added. So I can just do rigid body equals add a component rigid body. And the last thing I'm going to need to add is a float move speed. And this is just going to be how fast the player moves across the world. I'm going to set this to 400 for this demonstration. And then finally, we're going to add one helper function, void get input. And this will just be the function that we get the player's input from for the velocity. So here in the source code file, I'll define the update function. And in here, all we're going to be doing is calling the getInput function. So let's define the getInput function. So I already have some code prepared. Basically, what this code does, it pretty much just creates a 2D vector from the A and D keys and multiplies it by the move speed, and then applies that to the rigid body's velocity. And there's actually a typo in this code. These two should be swapped. Okay. So now that we've defined the getInput function and called the getInput function in update, if we just go ahead and build the project, we should be able to control this red player. Yeah, and as I press my A and D keys here, I can move around this red square. You'll notice that it's automatically slowing down, and the reason for that is as I remove the input velocity, the friction between the player and the floor just automatically slows it down. If I wanted to increase that rate, what I could do is go to the floor here and increase its its coefficient of friction to something much higher, for example. And if I build it again, you'll see the player slows down a lot quicker than it was before. I realize I didn't say it before, but in order to query input in this, you just call the input active function with reference to the key code that you want to look for. And delta time is also relevant here. The time elapsed between frames you can get by just doing gtime.delta time. So that's how you can create custom game objects and create a simple player controller using my game creation API/framework. Thanks for watching. Let me know in the comments if you have any questions.